Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Regenerative Design for Our Cities webinar. And this is part of NLA's Net Zero programme. My name is Benjamin O'Connor, and I'm a director at NLA. It's great to see so many of you joining our webinar this morning. If those of you who don't know us that well, NLA is London's built environment community. We're a cross-sector membership organisation for everyone committed to shaping a better city. Please do consider becoming a member of NLA at nla.london for as little as £20 per month to be part of the conversation. Our 30,000 plus members work across all aspects of city governance, planning, design, development and management, spanning both public and private sectors. We're guided by the New London Agenda, which is our best practice framework for city making. We come together year round to develop new collective solutions for London, forming new ideas and partnerships, enhancing lifelong skills and empowering a more diverse workforce. Our work has global relevance and is shared with cities around the world. Today in this webinar, we're going to be hearing from experts in sustainable infrastructure, architecture and engineering, who will explore innovative approaches to regenerative design in cities and buildings. They'll be presenting holistic contributions that incorporate systems thinking and nature-led solutions, demonstrating how regenerative design can help repair the damage already inflicted on our planet. Ultimately, regenerative design that reimagines existing frameworks and provides clear benchmarks and approaches is needed to actively restore ecosystems and positively contribute to future generations. We're first going to be hearing from David Cheshire, who is Sustainability Director at AECOM, who's going to be outlining the regenerative, I'm going to be saying that word regenerative a lot today, regenerative design principles needed to contribute to resilient infrastructure and net zero cities. Subsequently, we'll see a presentation from Louisa Bowles, who's Head of Sustainability at Architecture Practice Hawkins Brown. She'll be explaining how she is leading on the integration of regenerative design within the practice, and also delving into some knowledge sharing, ownership, and steward in regenerative design. Our final presentation this morning is going to be by Tom Gibson, who's Associate Director at Haworth Tompkins, who's speaking about applying a local approach to regenerative design and how to embed the principles into different stages of a project. We're then going to invite all our presenters and two additional speakers, including Shreya Aneja, who is an architectural designer at Sustainable Design Coordinator at White Architecture, and Amelia Lennon, a graduate sustainability consultant at Hoare Lee. That's enough for me. So there will, of course, as with all of our webinars, be plenty of opportunities to ask questions. So please do use the Zoom Q&A function throughout. So if you have a question during any of the presentations, do pop that there and I'll get to as many of those questions in the panel discussion at the end. Okay, I'd like to invite our first speaker to present, and that's David Cheshire. So David, I'll hand over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Yes, so I'd like to really just talk about what I've found and learnt about regenerative design over the last couple of years of research I've done for a book that I wrote for our IBA. And I think want to just cover a couple of things. One is cover what does it mean from as far as I can see, and what are the design principles we need to follow, and then really just a couple of case studies I'm just going to very quickly mention just to show that it's happening in practice. I think, this first slide is really about just looking at our cities and seeing that, that lots of the parts of our cities are really not very green. We have lots of space that is surrounded by, tarmac and concrete and glass and steel. And actually that's causing, a couple of problems. One is that it means we forget about our connection with nature, and the reminder that we are part of nature and natural systems. But also, it means that we're not actually incorporating anything natural into the world. So there's no natural systems actually in our cities to help with our daily survival, really. And if you look at what's happening, what's so important to us is that we have oxygen to breathe and fresh air to breathe and fresh water and and food to eat, and that's all dependent on beautiful ecosystems like this that are thriving and active, as well as what's happening in our oceans to provide oxygen and everything. And that breath that we're just about to take, that's just about having those ecosystems to survive, really. And so and as we've seen, we're in serious danger of just destroying the whole life cycle, the whole life support system that we have. on the planet. And actually, it's, interesting looking at cities themselves and towns and everything, that actually they are very efficient in accommodating a huge amount of people. Um, but the problem is actually and in a relatively small space and relatively small footprint. But if you look at the key thing to this is really the infrastructure and the support mechanisms that make it all possible to build what we're doing and to live how we live. And if you look at the amount of water treatment and space we need to do all the water treatment at the upstream, but also the downstream impacts we're having now with putting sewage into our rivers, into the oceans, and the impact that's having. You've got the massive infrastructure we need to create our net zero electricity supply. There's all that food that I don't know about you, but we've all that food that we're flying from southern Spain from those polytunnels that use up huge amounts of water. I don't know about you, but a lot of that ends up in my fridge, and then I forget about it and it goes rotten. And you think, what a huge waste we've created there, where we could be growing it much more locally. And then, lastly is the sort of area I've been talking about a lot previously, which is around the circular economy and around the amount of damage we're doing to precious ecosystems when we're mining and quarrying all those resources we need to build our buildings. And what that's doing is it's pushing us over the safe operating space and safe operating limits we can be within within the planet. And this is Stockholm Resilience Centre has done I thought it was a really interesting piece of work they've been doing for a number of years now to say what is our safe operating limits, and that's the green circle there. And then where have we transgressed that? And you can see all of these times that we've already well and truly very much in debt to the system. And just a couple of examples on the bottom there, it sort of talks about the biochemical flows. That's phosphorus and nitrates, which are basically what we use as fertilizer, which we create, pour it all over the land, but it's also what's in sewage as well. And that's what's overloading the system. And then the other one there is novel entities, which are microplastics and the forever chemicals that are being found everywhere around the world. So if you're having a cup of tea while you're watching this, you're busy absorbing microplastics into your bloodstream right now, I'm afraid to say. So, I mean, what the whole regenerative for me, and what the research I've done, and I know everyone's got different views on this, but from what I've seen, that I think this diagram by Bill Reed is really interesting, showing the idea that what I've been trying to do for the last 30 years is talk about being less bad, so trying to make buildings more sustainable. But all it's really been doing is making using a little bit less energy, a little bit water, a little bit less materials, and generating a little bit less waste. And actually, what it's done, if you look at the climate and biodiversity crisis, okay, it's helped and it's got the story started, and the discussion going. But actually, I think we're at the point now, very clearly, where we need to move well beyond that to a point where we're actually starting to make buildings actually have a positive impact on the planet. And I know that sounds crazy, but there are projects and examples where we're doing that, where we're net positive, we're generating more energy than we need, capturing every drop of rainwater and using it in our buildings rather than treating it as a sort of waste that has to be chucked away from the built environment. And really, I think the key thing is start to make buildings and the built environment an active part of the ecosystem. So it's actively restoring and regenerating the ecosystem. And really, just as what I've done in my book is basically sort of set out this diagram builds up, is set out really the design principles and how this could work in practice to try and bring a concept down into something more tangible. And it really starts with this idea that most of us are working on a project focus on the site and sit within and look at the red line boundary and don't really think much beyond that. And I think what's important, obviously, for this agenda is that we think beyond the site and look at how the site is nested within the locality, but it's also nested within the region, and most importantly, it's sitting within the ecosystem, and that's what we're all dependent on. And then round the outside, which I probably should have put as a red line round the outside, is that that we are ultimately bound by the planetary limits, and we can't transgress and go beyond those. And then came up with, based on the research, with 7 design principles, which I don't have time to go through them now, but basically this idea that really understanding and being rooted in place. It seems to be very key to this, to really understand the site from an ecological perspective and a social perspective, as much as the architectural heritage and all those other things that we normally look at. So really get to understand the watershed and all those things. And I think sort of two real key messages out of all of this that came out for me, and sort of revelations where I got the sort of the brain tingle thing going. I thought, yeah. One was really around looking at ecosystem services. And this is very much something that some of my colleagues I sit next to in the infrastructure side and the environment side do all the time, is look at this idea of ecosystem services, which I'll come on to in a second. And then the other one is around this idea of environmental budgets. So saying, look, we can only generate this much energy on the site through renewables. So we can only cover the roof in PV or photovoltaics or whatever. Great. And that's our becomes our environmental budget, and say that's all that we're going to use on this site. Then stay within the limits. And the same with water. With this much rainwater falls on the site over a year, we're going to capture that and use that on our site. And the other design principles you can see are sort of fairly self-explanatory. And so this ecosystem services thing, as I say, was really interesting because, as I say, my infrastructure colleagues use it all the time. But what that is really it's about what the ecosystem does to sustain and enhance life. And these are some of the things that a great researcher called Maybright Pedersen-Zari came up with, to say these things she was saying we can replicate in the built environment. So regulation of biochemical flows. So, that's all the things you do in, GCSE biology, the oxygen, so the nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycle, the water cycle, all those things. And then, but also looking at how you regulate those flows. As I say, we tend to push everything away from our buildings as almost like a pollutant, but actually, the water is very, very valuable, and what we should be doing is storing and making the sort of sponge cities idea that they're doing in China. And then things like nutrient cycle and something like soil. I mean, soil is just never talked about on any BREEAM lead or anything that I've ever looked at. And actually, but it's absolutely critical to our survival. It's thousands of I think something like 40% of the species on the planet are in the soil. And then so really that's sort of basically what I was trying to get across. And I think just see just very quickly 4 case studies. There's lots of case studies in my book, but just passing mention to sponge cities, the idea of what's going in China to make our cities much more permeable and absorbing and retaining and then releasing water much more slowly. The PAE living building in Portland is a brilliant example of being net positive. It generates more energy than it uses. It captures all the rainwater. It does grey water recycling, does black water, and it composts the black water as well, and it captures the nutrients. It actually captures the phosphorus and the nitrates out of the grey water, and it uses it and sells it as fertilizer. I think they get about $50,000 a year as a revenue stream from the waste, which I think is just fantastic. Let's banish the concept of waste. There's nothing wasteful. There's no waste. It's only nutrients. And then 2 other things there: urban agriculture. So this building, the ICTA rooftop greenhouse in Barcelona, has a greenhouse integrated into it. But not only is it integrated architecturally, it also in terms of the MEP. So it actually is exchanging heat, the warm, humid. CO2 laden air goes into the greenhouse from the labs and the offices, and then exchanges gaseous exchange and heat exchange between the two. And of course, it's a very symbiotic relationship. And the last one there is I'm calling bioutilization, but this idea of a microbial using algae basically to help clean up the air. So it bubbles air through the micro algae facade system, which cleans it up and oxygenates it and captures the CO2. It also feeds off the grey water, the nutrients in the grey water, which is fed in through it. And then over time, it over every week, they download, if that's the word, they download the algae that's grown, and then that is dried out and it's used as medicine, or as all sorts of medicine, food, or it can be used as a biomass, basically to be anaerobically digested for energy. So, really amazing. I mean, you couldn't create something mechanically that could do what that microalgae facade is doing. So it's cleaning up everything. And then just to finish, I think this is my favorite case study, which is the Skip project in Amsterdam, where the idea of sea level rises is front of mind very much there, and the threat of that. The land prices are very high, so this was a collective of people that all got together and built a floating community. Not only is it amazing in that perspective, but it's also it's net positive in terms of energy. It's got a microgrid where it exchanges energy between the different dwellings, and so they become prosumers, so they're producing and consuming at the same time. And it captures rainwater, and it's capturing heat out of the water, and all sorts of really clever things. I think really interesting project. That's it. Thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you very much, Dave. Really fascinating presentation. Lots to think about. Just to remind our audience who joined while Dave was presenting, please do pop any questions you've got for Dave or any of our speakers in the Zoom Q&A, and we'll get to those at the end. Okay, our next speaker is Louisa Bowes, who's Head of Sustainability at Hawkins Brown. Louisa.
Just unmute myself. Thank you. Thanks so much for that, David. That was really fascinating. And I think some link messages, so hopefully our presentation will be complementary. So yeah, I'm just going to talk about the point of view of a practice. Collectively, I would say there's 250 of us emerging into this new sort of trend or new way of thinking, and evolving our current thinking to work out what we're doing well now and what we need to do better. So our starting point at Hawkins Brown was this quote from Oliver Broadbent. It chimes a lot with what David said. So what if our work designing our built environment not only minimizes harm to the environment, but contributes to healing and regeneration? And that's what's progressing things for us. Just a bit about Hawkins Brown, because the way we are starting to evolve regenerative design completely ties into how we work as a practice. So there's 250 of us. We're spread across 5 locations now, and we work across a number of different project scales and different project sectors, and that cross-fertilization is really important. Our ethos is also tied into this, so serious about society, human about architecture, and we think for us that's a really strong foundation to the ethos of what regenerative design means. Every year we hold a research week. So this year we decided to make the theme regenerative design. It was for a number of purposes. So we were upskilling the office. We were talking about all of the different aspects and how we might progress them as a practice. We kicked off the week with an introduction, bit of terminology, bit of discussion. What are people worried about as well? So what barriers do people see? Because we need to tackle them if we're going to do any of this. And then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, we had some interactive workshops focusing on creating briefs, integrating social value and engagement, and then long-term legacies, and then a keynote speech by Oliver Broadbent, which was really inspiring and put a lot of pragmatism actually on some of this. So this was a really helpful slide, I think, chimed with a lot of people, because they would, in the same way David has really articulated untangling some of this, they were trying to say, well, what do you actually mean? And we were trying to say, well, sustainability is the left-hand side, so we're just trying to do things less badly. And the regenerative side is the right-hand side, so net positive, the whole web of life, ecosystems, it's holistic, and it's not just sole focus on certain things. And we recognize as a practice we're on the journey of this. We're starting from the point of view where we've got some great expertise, we've got some great projects, but we need to get more consistent at applying the various principles. That's just a reassurance for people on the call who might be in the same position. And we created these diagrams for the practice, again, to just explain in simple terms what we're trying to move from and to. So we're trying to move from a linear thinking, where we take things from nature and use them. And we're trying to work more in partnership with nature and local ecosystems. And again, chiming with one of David's messages, all of the sort of human created systems that we work with in our built environment and in our lives have the chance to mimic or work in better symbiosis with these natural rhythms and ecosystems. So I've got 3 slides on the interactive workshops that we ran. They're very brief, so if there's any questions, can pick them up. But the first workshop, we tailored it around Donut for Economics for the urban environment, the development framework. And these sort of set of quite holistic way of thinking, okay, well, these are all the great principles. How do we measure them? It's, for me, potentially by no means a finished piece of work, but it's a really useful way in for people who want something a bit more tangible. So to be honest, in the workshop, we talked a lot about the center of the circle, not the outside. We generally talked about the themes and applied them to case studies. And tried to work out what the priorities were for a certain client, for a certain site, for a certain project. And then we took those key priority themes into the workshop on the Wednesday, which was about embedding social value. So what we're trying to do is say, on a lot of our projects, we're now having to apply formal social value commitments. What can we tie into our regenerative thinking to use that time and money that we're already investing in our projects to actually enhance a single coherent outcome towards regenerative thinking and design? And the final workshop was probably the most fun one and the one that most people remember the most. But we wrote articles about our projects, our case studies that we'd developed over the week, and thought, well, what will people say about these in 30 years' time? And how will we tell the story? Because storytelling is a really helpful tool in trying to win hearts and minds around, why we're suggesting certain things and why they're going to be a really good idea, not just in the short term, but the longer term. And this is just a snapshot of some of the findings. So there were some great things and some things that are challenging. So there's a lot of overwhelm. Is regenerative design even possible? But there was a lot of positivity as well around the creativity that it allows designers, the emphasis back on the local, and also as a practice, tying it back into our ethos. And what are we doing next? So following Research Week, we developed 3 overlays to the REBA plan of work. So we focused on regenerative design, we focused on social value and net zero. We did one specifically for regenerative because it seemed from the Research Week that people needed a little bit more to go on that's tangible about what types of things you might think about at each REBA stage. And also we're trying to bring performance and the human aspect of that much closer together under this umbrella. We produced an engagement graphic, which was about working together and engaging our local communities and stakeholders in the ambition to push regenerative outcomes. These materials on these slides we're going to release on our website as open source downloads. So that'll be coming out at the end of April. So keep an eye on that. And then just to finish some case studies, again, going to whip through quite quickly, but just to give a snapshot of the type of work or the analysis we went through of some of our projects to think, are we already applying some of this thinking and where can we do it better? So for us, Earl's Court Master Plan represents a really powerful briefing and set of engagement strategies on this site, and this was submitted for planning a few months ago. There are a whole host of different inspirational aspects of this project, but the theme of regenerative design here was this constant focus back on a nature-led strategy, and also the focus on long-term legacy and how we plan the infrastructure to allow that level of flexibility and evolution. And a really successful piece of this process was the Public Realm Inclusivity Panel, which took applications from young people up to the age of 15 to take part in thinking and designing the public realm, and enabled them to develop some real long-term life skills through that process, and also have a lot of influence over the final design. Our Agar regeneration project, it's had a relatively large amount of media coverage, but in terms of relationship to regenerative themes, there are two quite strong aspects to this working with the London Borough of Camden. There was the strong focus on the existing community on the site at the beginning and how to retain that community on the site while the works were being undertaken. And the community were part of that conversation. And anyone who wants to stay on the estate is able to remain living there. And then also the focus on combating fuel poverty. So the Passive House certification has carried on through all the new build homes, through all the phases, because of this single focus on reducing fuel poverty. It's been a massive commitment. This is a slightly different example where we worked on the Teddy Higher Education campus at the British Land Paperworks Master Plan in the grounds of the Printworks. And this was a focus on design for disassembly and reuse and salvage, because this campus we knew was only probably going to exist for the next 7 to 10 years. So every component has been designed so that it can be taken off and reused elsewhere. There's also use of pre-used modular units as the base build, and they can be taken apart and reused when they get to the end of their life. So that was part of the original brief for that project. And my final case study is St Mary's Catholic Voluntary Academy in Derby. We've been working with the Department of Education using their Gen Zero specifications. And it's, in my view, probably the best case study we have of a fully regenerative project in the office at the moment. It delivers all energy on site, and actually the 12-month POE showed that it is contributing energy back to the grid. So that's a brilliant success for the team. And also there's a PhD research ongoing around what the concentration on the biophilic brief and connection to nature and use of natural materials in the school has done for attainment levels. And there's some really encouraging results, and this research will continue. So this is a 12-month snapshot, and I can only imagine what they can do over the next 12 months. So thanks very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Louisa. So just for the audience benefit, we are going to be sharing these slides, so you will be able to access those after the event. Okay, so our third and final presentation is going to be from Tom Gibson, who's Associate Director at Hawth Tompkins.
Thanks, Ben. Sorry, I'm just... there we go. Yeah, I just wanted to sort of apply some of the principles actually that Louisa and Dave have been talking about, and really, you know, demonstrate how we're sort of grappling with these. I think in a similar way to Hawkins Brown, we're, you know, at the beginnings of our journey and sort of understanding this really important mindset shift towards regenerative design. So it's just worth sort of saying at the outset that like Hawkins Brown, we're really lucky enough to work across a range of different sectors and at different scales, from everything from, you know, conservation of historic listed fabric, lots of really lovely, incredibly exciting cultural projects, right across the spectrum towards sort of light industrial, workplace and residential. Here we go. So this is a sort of toolkit that really has evolved over the last maybe 5 years internally within Hawth Tompkins. And in a similar way to sort of Dave's concentric rings diagram or some of the graphics that Louisa was just sharing, it's really a sort of, you know, a checkpoint or a reminder of all the various factors that we should be considering at each of the design stages. So we do a review within each design stage with our sort of head of sustainability. And, you know, that's really kind of bringing to sort of focus, you know, people and community, so natural systems, and also energy and whole life carbon. So really trying to sort of adopt a holistic approach to the design process. The first project I wanted to just share a little bit of detail about. I'm going to talk briefly about 2 projects and 2 different localities, as Ben mentioned at the beginning of the webinar. The first is a new garden community on the edge of Colchester, where we've just finished a master plan, and we're starting to dive into the early phases of some of the kind of more specific sort of planning work. yeah, quite incredible site really, which is a patchwork of existing agricultural fields of really different sort of varying qualities, some quite sort of poor soil health. As Dave was mentioning, it's sort of absolutely integral to the sort of the systems that underpin food production and health. However, on the western edge of the site, you can see there's a sort of really rich seam of existing green landscape where it borders Colchester. And the other incredible thing about the overall area for the master plan was this incredibly rich biodiverse hedgerow network. So that has really sort of underpinned the master plan and some of the initial kind of zoning. So what were the opportunities really? That we really kind of worked really hard to work with the client team right from the outset, and there's three different councils involved in this master plan. So we're trying to introduce the idea of long-term thinking and being a good ancestor. Like the hedgerows network, letting nature lead and inform the master plan thinking. The idea of promoting circular resources and creating really a place for everyone. So embedding new forms of transport and employment into the master plan alongside the larger residential component was really key. Trying to really drive down use of the car and think about changing shifts socially. Our team here has done a really, I think, quite amazing amount of stakeholder engagement, actually. I think it's over 60 sessions that we held, what we call road shows, including sessions with groups like the Essex Young Designers, which is the image in the top left. So that really was about sort of posing the question to the local community and asking, what type of infrastructure, they needed and wanted. And that helped sort of inform really these key kind of project aspirations. So top left, thinking about private sufficiency, so that the scale of a single home, but actually creating public luxury, so facilities and amenities that are shared amongst a group of houses. Responding to the sort of local character of the site, prioritizing walking and cycling over the car. As I mentioned, a kind of landscape-led approach, building off that existing hedgerow network and biodiversity. Of course, trying to embed ideas of accessibility and inclusivity into the master plan, and really identifying a range of opportunities for education. This was a really fascinating. Oh, sorry, I've gone too far. Sorry, there's a bit of a lag on the. There we go. Go back to this piece of work by a really interesting anthropologist called Robin Dunbar, who identified a series of different social groups or scales of social group, right from the sort of nuclear family at 4 or 5 people with a single home, up to 1,000+ people, who is the sort of what he thought of the upper limit of people that you can recognize, and actually that idea of a sort of a neighborhood. And what we've really tried to do in the master plan here is focus on the sort of 150 group size, creating, what we're calling clusters, residential clusters. So that's anything from shared playgrounds or shared mews between sort of back gardens, for example, that really foster, chance encounters and connect people, sort of 10 households around that sort of level. And then these were the sort of 6 core principles really that we've arrived at as part of the master plan. So, prioritizing both green, but also the blue infrastructure that that Dave was talking about, aiding stormwater attenuation, rainwater capture, etc. I mentioned repurposing, the existing sort of biodiverse hedgerow corridors. That led us towards sort of establishing 3 distinct neighborhoods, which we're connecting with a new rapid transport system, as well as connecting in with existing transport networks. And really fundamentally, I think actually trying also to insert employment centres and work and education opportunities across those 3 zones to minimise kind of commuting and travel and actually sort of refocus on the local area. So that's really sort of overall, we're driving this idea of resiliency, and the sort of built fabric, and new neighborhoods we've called sort of the community, those existing green spaces that we're allowing room for growth and expansion and connecting to, we've called the commons. And then a series of new public and cycle and pedestrian ways we've called connectors. So a very brief glimpse of that, but this is how they're hopefully going to come together with the connectors arriving in these new neighborhoods, hubs, sort of small neighborhoods or connections of schools and work opportunities. And then really, I think, really exciting opportunities to green or extend existing landscape along these new transport connections. And this is the overall sort of illustrative master plan. I think really wonderful kind of mosaic of green space and residential and employment development, connected with that new rapid transport system that you can see in pink there. The second project I just wanted to dive into briefly was a really wonderful project we've been working on for about 7 or 8 years now, which is a new performing arts center and research facility for the American Repertory Theatre at Harvard University. And again, I think, these early conversations with the client, really, we tried to embed some of these kind of core principles of regenerative design. So the Venn diagram on the left here, was us positioning the project at the center of these 3 core pillars. So public health, universal access, and sustainability and regenerative design. And actually that has sort of remained constant and been a really kind of useful reminder throughout, the frankly roller coaster, the journey that we've gone on over the last 8 years. And the brilliant thing about, being connected with Harvard was we've had access to, experts across a number of different fields. An example of that is we did a really in-depth peer review process with the Harvard School for Public Health, who developed this helpful framework you're seeing on the right-hand side of the slide, where they've developed what they call the 9 foundations of a healthy building, that's been developed, from 20, 30 years of research into sick building syndrome, for example. So that actually was a really helpful process that steered the early design development. We're targeting Living Building Challenge on this project, which I think for an arts organization like ART is a brilliant sort of holistic approach. It focuses on aspects of what they call petals, such as equity, beauty, and health and happiness. So, more intangible and qualitative factors, not just the sort of your more data-driven environmental factors that we're used to, such as, water, energy, and green technology. And I think what's a real game changer about LBC actually is the fact that you don't receive certification of your project until quite an extensive period of post-occupancy monitoring and evaluation has been carried out. So you have to prove essentially that, that your performance gap isn't too great, that, your design is actually operating in the way that you envisaged. So that's really fascinating, and looking forward to going through that process once this project is complete. This is the site, just down from the famous Harvard American football stadium. So the top of the page is the sort of tighter residential grain of Lower Alston, which is traditionally quite a working class area. And then at the bottom of the page on the right, bottom right side across the river, is the historic Harvard campus. So right from the very beginning, that the project was also about sort of forming a bridge or a link between these 2 parts of the local Cambridge and Alston community. This was a sort of initial plan graphic, really, which spoke to this concept of rooms with no names, or designing for flexibility. So we have 3 performance spaces, 1 outdoor in red here, and they're different scales, but can host all sorts of different activities. So they're really, designed to support flexible artistic use and different sort of modes of operation. And they're supplemented by a sort of family or suite of studio and rehearsal spaces. and all the sort of theatre technology, the seating systems, the decking, the lighting and speakers is all designed to sort of travel and move between these spaces. So the idea is that we're developing a kind of building or a frame for ART and Harvard to use in a number of different ways and that can evolve over time. It's not set in its own ways. We're really lucky to, again, have had access to some of the experts at Harvard who helped us undertake outdoor air quality assessments, which was really fascinating. It identified 2 shoulder seasons in the spring and autumn where the particulate matter and pollen levels were low enough to actually bring fresh air directly into the performance spaces via attenuated acoustic cleaner. So we're able for about a third of the year in what's quite a sort of challenging extreme climate in Massachusetts to utilize natural ventilation to, obviously reduce energy use, but also kind of boost, fresh air and health within the space. And as you can see, the ventilation stacks that are required to sort of utilize the stack effect and exhaust the hot air once it heats up and rises throughout these spaces has actually informed the building form and the silhouette. We undertook some really interesting embodied carbon analysis on the superstructure at the beginning of the project, and that led us down a sort of path of maximizing the amount of mass timber structure for the majority of the building. So everything above ground except the fly tower for the largest performance space is mass timber. And actually that has caused some interesting technical challenges further down the line to do with acoustics and fire. So some really valuable lessons learned, but obviously, really sort of pushing the envelope here on what's quite a sort of challenging building typology, trying to minimize, embodied carbon for that big piece of the pie, the superstructure. Another kind of key kind of conversation right from the beginning was how we sort of democratize the architectural language and make it feel sort of welcoming. And one of the ways we've tried to do that is collaborating with a local artist called Pro Black on a large scale mural for the north of the building. And he's just in the process actually of setting up a series of community workshops that will inform the design for this large scale artwork that you can see here. And while we're also looking at this sort of aerial shot of the building, it's also worth just noting that we've incorporated quite extensive green roof and PV systems. So again, going back to that concept that Dave shared earlier of Sponge City, we're trying to hold as much water on site as possible before, slowly releasing it into the sewer systems. And then just a brief glimpse of progress on site. So after quite a long journey, it's really exciting that we're starting to see the building emerge.
Sorry, Tom, just if you could try and wrap up quite soon because we've got to move on. Thank you.
That's all right. Last slide. So just and finally, just this is the sort of visualizations of what we're hoping the project will look like at the end of next year. So that's it. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks very much, Tom. Sorry, I hate doing that. It was so interesting.
No.
It's so much to talk about, and we've got sort of around 15 minutes or so for our panel, and we are joined by Shreya from White Architecture and Amelia from Hoare Lee. So I'm going to come to Shreya and Amelia first, and then I'm going to come straight into audience questions, just so we have enough time to get some of those done. So Shreya, could you tell us a bit about some of the localized approaches to regenerative design that White Architecture has proposed?
Yes, sure. So just to give a bit of background before I dive into the design ethos with respect to regenerative design, for those who might not know, White Architecture is spread across Scandinavia, UK, and Germany. So we've sort of done projects across various scales and sectors. And sustainability has been at the heart of these projects for the past few decades. But regenerative design is something that's come up in the last few years very heavily and sort of something that we're trying to concentrate on. And it's not just, as everybody discussed, not just about protecting the ecosystems, but sort of trying to bring them back and also responding sensitively to the local context, whether it is socially or very important to us materially. So just quickly, a project that I've been working on and something that's been sort of the focus of our attention at the London office has been the Willinger Cancer Centre, which is a healthcare project based in Wales, UK, and it's currently in construction. And we sort of try to apply the holistic approach of, and of course, it's quite difficult when you're trying to apply regenerative design to a hospital project, which is already very service heavy and has so many standards and protocols to follow. But we tried from the very beginning, from reducing the footprint to sort of doing an in-depth research on how do we reduce the environmental impact while also ensuring that the health and well-being of the patients is, at the main focus of the design. So all of that was incorporated. And at the heart of all of that was the materiality. So we ended up going with quite a few natural materials for construction, including timber, which was, again, came with its own roadblocks. As Tom was mentioning, it's never easy with structure and fire, but incredible lessons learned. Hemp blocks, again, just a side note, but hemp blocks in UK are actually under the Drug Enforcement Agency and not the agricultural sector. So you can imagine how less standardized it was and how difficult it is to actually scale up and use that as a building product, even though it's so incredibly helpful with respect to the thermal performance, which can further help in reducing energy, but also just as a natural material for the patients inside. So we sort of chose to step back and instead view Wilindra as almost a facilitator of these materials, that if we can try and incorporate these materials in smaller parts of the hospital and then sort of show that this can be done and push the boundaries inside of projects in the future. So that was sort of the perspective that we had going into it. And just to zoom out a little bit and give one more example was of positive energy districts that we have been working on specifically in the Swedish offices, which is basically districts which consume more energy than they, which produce more energy than they consume. And we've already had a successful implementation of that with the Uppsala Business District, which by 2031, the entire district is set to be net positive. And an interesting approach in that was reusing waste heat. So that was quite interesting to work with and see how a small approach like that can really radicalize and change the entire project. But I guess one of the bigger aspects of doing a positive energy district was being involved in the entire loop of from the stakeholders, from the authority to making the brief, to being involved with the energy suppliers themselves, so that not only is it regenerative and net positive right now, but it continues to be in the future and is resilient throughout. So yes, I guess the approach has been sort of across different scales and sectors for us.
Great, thanks very much, Shreya. Amelia, I'm going to come to you next. And if you could tell us a bit about what the kind of importance of a nature-led approach is to Hawley, and perhaps tell us about some of the tools you've been developing.
Yeah, sure. So there are so many reasons that it's important, but I'd say primarily it's the best way to approach design that's going to lead to climate change resilience. So if we take the spring drought that we're having right now, these kinds of more extreme weather patterns are becoming more common, and for nature to cope with this and to bounce back, we'll need to design and support environments that can draw on that resilience that a nature-led approach can foster. So in terms of specific projects, it was interesting to hear Louise talk about Earls Court from an architect's perspective, because we also worked on that from an ESG perspective. And for this, we created a tool called Biome. So that's intended to quantify regenerative outcomes that are a bit harder to measure, such as social value, and crucially how these outcomes interact and are influenced by each other. So really trying to look at outcomes a bit more holistically and discern which nature-based solutions are most appropriate and are going to create the most value for a certain project. So one quick example for Earls Court, one of the key concerns was around water. So the Biome tool helped us to inform the sizing of tanks which will collect rainwater and be used for irrigation on the landscaping. So along with drought-resistant planting, that meant the landscaping needed no potable water and could be classified as water neutral.
Great, thank you so much. So right, I'm going to jump straight into audience questions. So we don't have a huge amount of time, so I'm going to combine a few things, including some things we discussed on our pre-call. And one of our audience members has asked a question in a slightly more blunt way, which I think is always good, and talks about the kind of elephant in the room around private capital, the CRE sector, who seem to only be interested in extracting from the natural world and making a profit. And then one of our panelists, I'm sorry, I forget which one of you it was, on email was suggesting we have a bit of a discussion on how we integrate this layer of thinking and design while kind of meeting all of the other pressures on a project. So time, fee, budget, regulatory compliance, how do we get this stuff done? So they kind of go together. I wonder if somebody would like to kick us off on that. Who would like to go first? No volunteers. Why don't I start with Dave? I'll start with Dave.
Yes. Yeah, no, it is. I mean, it's a fundamental question, isn't it? And I think it's the thing we're going to. There's many barriers, and I always say that if I wrote my book about the barriers, would be that would be here forever and be a very long book. But so I was trying to set out what the vision for the future could be, and then we've got to figure out how to get there really. And I think that's what this agenda is doing. I mean, I've just written on an article on LinkedIn actually that I just put up a couple of days ago was trying to talk about how we go through systems change and what levers we can pull. And there's a great the late Donella Meadows wrote all about leverage points and said the main thing is to focus on look at the whole system and then look at what the goals of the system and try and change those. So, as you say, the goals at the moment are about squeeze as much money out as we can out of a site and, net to gross and maximize net to gross and all that stuff. But actually, there are lots of other things we can change. And I think one example of that is the Regenerative Architectural Index that the Architects Declare have put forward, which is saying, look, instead of the Sterling Prize, which rewards beautiful designs, let's reward practices that are trying to push regenerative architecture. And it's in its second year now. I think it's brilliant. And I saw a great example of how that's working is that there was a call for a proposal the other day which said you have to be on Regenerative Architectural Index to be able to apply for this project. And you think, wow, if that was something that we could start to change how the system works, then we might be onto something good.
Right. Louisa, I think you wanted to input.
Well, only because I was going to put my hand up and say I was the one who asked it on the email. So it's great that someone else in the panel. I don't have the answers. But that's why I'm here to learn. But I suppose one of the things we've been exploring as a bit of a takeaway, other than the research week, obviously, as a bit of a takeaway, one of the things we've been exploring with our clients, and it does take a whole team effort, I think. So some of the examples that Shreya said and Tom said, and Amelia talked about, it's a team effort. So everyone has to pull in the same direction, and having that strong vision is definitely the starting point, as Dave said. So if you don't have the vision, you can't even work out the steps to get there. So we're concentrating a lot on that, but we're also figuring out for ourselves where we think the levers might be. So we're doing work with some clients at the moment to figure out where the business case for some of this stuff is. So if we look at water systems and the fact that we predict we probably will have water shortages in the first place, over a long period of time, if you make the business case for infrastructure that's put in now, we should be able to financially get the two to match. There's also interesting in things coming in around water, well, if we can do more on site, perhaps we can pay less for the off-site works in order to facilitate a new number of homes or whatever, and maybe the two in the end balance out. Or valuing a building as an asset, the materials in it, if we want to strip them out or we need to do demolition, having that as a financial asset that isn't just a problem to be got rid of, but actually provides value in another way. Those are other sort of levers we're starting to try and pull. So we're looking at it from an ethical and also with the systems we have at the moment, where can we intervene?
I think what's interesting is that this is something that clearly people care about. And actually, I think if you step back from the technical piece, actually people want to live and work in buildings that think this way and deliver these kind of principles. That in itself is an economic driver. If you think of young city workers and that talent, they want to work for companies who are going to choose those sorts of buildings. So for me, right there, that's the business case. So it's sort of stepping back and we kind of get in the detail, but actually go, look, we all want to work in these buildings and we choose why we work and what companies we work for. So if we don't bring them our skill and our talent, then they're not going to make money. So does anyone else want to input on this bit before we move on to the final question? Okay, because I want to move on to the land use question, because Amelia did bring this up in our chat, but one of our questions from the audience is, how have you addressed the challenges associated with construction on brownfield and greenbelt sites? Talking about the greenbelt, we have only 3 minutes, but how have these developments been received by the farmers who are losing their land for these projects? And more generally, how do we deal with the issue of land use? So maybe Amelia, if you want to kick us off on that one, and then anyone else can pick up.
Oh gosh, yeah, that's a big one, isn't it? I think ultimately it's got to be a case by case assessment, really. There can't be blanket rules around you can never do this or you always have to do this. You have to really look at the needs of a specific community, a specific ecology, and try and weigh things up as best as possible. And then if building has to happen, I think getting away from this idea that buildings are not nature and buildings are separate to nature is really important. And we have to try and come to an understanding that urban environments are still part of nature and there shouldn't be a separation there. Yeah.
Great. Tom?
Yeah, just to piggyback on what Amelia said, I think the other key component is there's some really interesting new forms of co-design emerging. And perhaps a sort of old word for that is stakeholder engagement, isn't it? But really actually pushing that to evolve and create, genuine co-design with some of the sort of local communities. That for me feels key. Like the piece I was describing on the Colchester master plan, where we were literally on the road and kind of speaking to 60 plus different groups of people at different times, and and across 3 different boroughs as well. So that was sort of fundamental in forming the early master planning thinking on that project.
Great. Did anyone else want to pick up on this one? I've got a final question otherwise. Shreya?
Yeah, no, just very quickly. I think I agree. I feel like what Emilia was saying, like if a building has to happen, there's no reason why it has to stand on its own 2 feet and, dissociate from the context that it was coming from in the first place. And I feel like we face that a lot because Willindra Cancer Center is in like a beautiful landscape area. And we really felt that, okay, it's a hospital for cancer patients, so it is for good. But then again, it's a landscape, which is very beautiful. So we wanted to preserve that biodiversity. So I think at the end of the day, it's sort of like, how do you justify that land use? And then what do you do, which is for the best case and a positive impact in the end.
Great. I realize we're at time, but I'm going to run over a little bit. Sorry to the audience, we're going to run over by a few minutes, but I do want to come to each of you with just as short as you can, kind of key takeaway for the audience in terms of what do you think they can do in their roles when they go, they come off the webinar. What do you think is really important as an action to take away from today? And why don't I start with Dave again, as we started with you?
I was hoping to be last. Good question. I think it's, for me, it's been about learning, this whole agenda really, and I think it's a lot about understanding ecosystems and understanding ecology and that perspective on things. The ecologists typically have a walk-on part, don't they, on projects? But I think getting to understand what that's all about in a much more detail, I think is so it's offline research. I think not on live projects. Do that first, and then apply it.
Great. I'll come to Amelia next.
One thing that people can do, I think one thing we can try and do is remember that we can't do it all and try and be really local and achievable in what we're trying to change, and just kind of looking at our community and even just the street we live on. Can we plant some wildflower seeds? Can we pick up litter? Like we're not going to solve every problem individually, so it's trying to just see what you can actually do and have that sense of kind of achievement and connection.
Great, thank you. Shreya, I'll come to you next.
Yeah, I think I often feel that people see regenerative design in a zoom in perspective of like landscape and ecology, but it's so much more beyond and goes beyond that as well. So I think understanding going beyond the site and living with nature, I think that's something that we can perhaps deal with more.
Tom?
I just wanted to highlight the peer review process we did on the Harvard projects. I think that actually has been really sort of fundamental in shifting the way that I think we should be designing. So carving out the time, and as a little bit referring to what Dave said about sort of external research, so identifying who the experts are and creating the opportunities for knowledge sharing and peer review.
Great. And Louisa, finally.
Goodness, I think there's good things in all of what everyone said. So to Dave's point, research definitely, but don't reinvent the wheel because there's so much already out there. I think, yes, start small because otherwise you'll just get so overwhelmed. So figure out what the priorities are that you can control. Find your allies in the team and then try and make collective action would be another one. Yeah, and talk to as many people as you possibly can. In your organization, outside of your organization. It's only by sharing these ideas that we'll start to make them bigger than the theory and more deliverable. So yeah.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you. Listen, really interesting discussion and presentation, guys. And I'm sure we could have gone on for another hour, definitely, with the questions coming in. For those of you who did ask a question, there's a few that we can get back to you on. So we'll share these with our speakers and hopefully we'll be able to respond on email. If you are interested in attending more of these events, then we've obviously got a big program of events. So do check out our website, nla.london. And yeah, for as little as £20 a month, you can become a member. So we are going to have a short poll now for the audience, just to give us some feedback on what you think we should be doing and how you enjoyed the event. But after that, feel free to head off and look forward to seeing you at the next event. Thank you to our speakers and thank you all for attending. Bye-bye.